possibly an event on, it's called Too Many Crises, Music and Politics on a Planet on Fire. And we've got a great lineup here today for everybody. We're all going to be considering the number of crises, the multiple crises that, on many fronts, that we're all looking at, feeling, engaging with today. Health crises, climate crises, extinctions, political violence, racism, sexism, misogyny, crises from economic recession, and government by, I'm not sure if it's killer clowns or exploding clown cars, but something anyway. What we're concerned with is how these crises are affecting music and how they're affecting musicians. And we're interested in exploring how music can, how these crises shape our perceptions of music and how music shapes our perception of crises. How do musicians respond to crises and how does music respond? So I'm Debbie Lyle. I'm a professor of international politics at Queen's University Belfast, and I have written on popular culture, media, and visuality. I'm just going to introduce our lovely panel here, and they're going to wave at you when I talk about them. First is Matt Davies. Wave, Matt. Matt is a lecturer in international political economy at Newcastle University and an adjunct professor at PUC in Rio de Janeiro. He's an editor of the book series Popular Culture and World Politics. He writes about varied topics concerning popular culture, world politics, and political economy, and is a massive music fan. Kevin Dunn, wave Kevin. Kevin is a professor in the Department of Political Science at Hobart and William Smith Colleges in Geneva, New York. One of his excellent recent books is Global Punk, Resistance and Rebellion in Everyday Life. So I hope we get to hear a little bit about that. He's a regular contributor to the influential, there we are, music zine Razor Cake. He owns and operates the Geneva Sound Factory recording facility, as well as Girth Records, an independent DIY record label. He plays in several bands, including the Srirachachas and What About Now? And I have seen Kevin perform in more professional settings, and he's always super punk. So we then have Marianne Franklin. Marianne is a professor of global media and politics at Goldsmiths University in London. Her academic background is history and music and social and political theory, and also international relations, so a thoroughly transdisciplinary human. She's published widely on music and politics, including the groundbreaking Resounding International Relations, which I love and all of my students love as well. There it is, look at that, thank you, Kevin. In recent years, she's been active in research and advocacy regarding human rights and the internet, serving as the co-chair of the Internet Rights and Principles Dynamic Coalition and the UN Internet Governance Forum. So we have lots of internet things to talk about as well as music. Maybe. And then we have Hikmawan Safullah, who loves to be called Indra. And he's a lecturer in the Department of International Relations at the University of Pajajaran. He's currently undertaking a PhD in politics at the Asia Research Centre, Murdoch University in Perth in Australia, with a thesis titled Underground Music Scene and Islamic Politics in Post-Authoritarian Indonesia. He was a former activist during Indonesia's authoritarian regime and also a guitarist for several punk rock, ska punk, and post-hardcore bands since the mid-1990s, including Habin Nagin, Young Coconut, and Alone at Last, that are based in the capital city of West Java, Bandung. So I have the chat function open on my phone. If you guys want to leave some questions for us in the chat, I'm more than happy to try to pick those up. This is going to be a free-ranging discussion. We're going to definitely interrupt one another when we have things to say. I have three big chunky questions that I want us to all engage with, hopefully. So as I said, if you have any chats, give us some chat and I'll try to feed those in. I wanted to start with really a general foundational question that I'm sure all of us have been thinking alongside and with for many, many years and experiencing. And that really is a question about politics with a small p, certainly around everyday life. What political work do we think that music can do? So can I ask Kevin to start us off with that?
As Debbie pointed out, most of my work is looking at DIY, do-it-yourself punk scenes around the globe. And I tend to focus on the social practices involved in music making, music recording, music performance, distribution, consumption. And I usually tend to think of the ways in which those social practices create alternative ways of being, the possibility for oppositional identities, the level of the individual, but also when people come together and form networks and communities or scenes, they can be sites of political resistance, overt political resistance. I'm thinking of, you're in Belfast right now, the way that the local punk scene in Belfast was really important in terms of anti-sectarian engagement during the Troubles, or Indra in Indonesia, right, where the local punk scene was really important for the anti-Suharto pro-democracy movement of the 1990s. And also, beyond those big scenes, the way they function as kind of discrete places for political engagement at everyday life. But I was actually having a conversation, so I'm gonna go my first clip, with Alice Bagg, who is the lead singer of the influential band The Bags from the first wave punk scene in Los Angeles. And what she was talking about, she opened up our conversation by talking about the way music functions as a nonverbal communication and connectivity, and drawing attention to the political potential in those nonverbal spaces. So if I may, let's see if I can pull this off. I want to share this interview, a little clip from Alice Bagg.
Well, first of all, I want to say that as a second language learner, music was super important to me because you can communicate in a nonverbal way. You can communicate with energy. It's energy to energy, right? So the arts and music in particular connect with your audience or with another person just because you're transmitting these vibrations in the air and they resonate in the other person's body with an immediacy that doesn't have to be processed through your mind. You don't have to think about the words and figure out what they mean and digest them. It's just immediate. Like I feel that person's anger, I feel their sadness, or I feel their commitment. So for me, music was a really important way that I communicated before I even learned to speak English. And then beyond that, I also feel like music helps us when we are going to be judged because maybe we don't speak, maybe we speak non-standard English, or maybe we have, we're judged because we have a certain tone to our voice, or because our voice or the way we speak communicates a certain income level or a certain educational level. So I feel like music circumvents all that. It's a more direct form of communication. And then there is the element of community. When you get in a room and you're connecting with all these people based on a sound and an energy, and they feel it, and it's like you blur the distinction between this is me and that's you, and all of a sudden it becomes us working together. I remember having an epiphany where I realized that was happening, that the audience was moving with me, that the audience was listening to me, that we were connecting at a really deep level. And at a certain point, I looked out into the audience and I couldn't see the end of the room. And I thought, this is more than just me connecting with the audience. This is me connecting with humanity. This could be, limitless. The source of this power that we're harnessing here is power. It's powerful.
And so, I want to juxtapose that conversation I had with Alice Bagg about kind of the nonverbal ways that music can make us come together and communicate, with a conversation I had with Donna Ramon, who's a punk writer, organizer, and activist, because she was focused directly in terms of the verbal communication that music can do, in terms of thinking about music education and kind of music as a form of education, in terms of exposing us to alternative ways of thinking. So let me just quickly share that if I can.
Well, early on, just being in DIY punk scenes, I was exposed to so many other ways of thinking. Just so even though I was already from a particular background that was going to be politically aligned with, you know, the immigrant experience, that doesn't necessarily mean that I was going to be aware of things like, you know, climate change, things like, I'm trying to think, like the really, really early stuff. LGBTQ rights, because I initially met people who were LGBTQ by the time I was, you know, 12, 13. As soon as you got into punk, if you were part of these outsider communities, you met these marginalized groups early on, and you were able to immediately recognize that they were people that deserved your time and effort, who deserved rights, and you saw their hardships firsthand. And so growing off of that, learning very early on when, you know, just having fun, how the cops would definitely start to target us, taught a lot of us a very early lesson as to who deserves the protection of the police as opposed to who deserves the oppressive arm of the police. And then just a lot of anti-authority, a lot of general feelings of anti-establishment, do-it-yourself, just kind of came along with it because it was so much part of the lifestyle to recognize those things and to learn from each other.
Yeah, and so I think for me, both those clips supplement how I think and write about the political practices and possibilities of music, right? Music does not exist outside of a social context. And I think these social contexts, whatever they may be, are rife with political possibilities. So I just wanted to throw that out as kind of my opening gambit there to see where other people are bringing to the table.
Thanks, Kevin. That's brilliant. I think that gives us a lot to chew on. Matt, can I turn to you and see if you have any kind of things you want to flesh that out with?
I'm really sympathetic with the stuff that Alice Bagg had to say about the way that whatever else music is, it's actually kind of an energy that our bodies share, right? It's something that connects us through specific sound waves and then through the way that rhythms, for example, make our bodies move together. So that stuff all seems extremely important to me. And one of the reasons I hope we can maybe stress that when we think about the political work music can do is that it helps us get away from the idea that the politics lies only in the words, right? That it's somehow that the words are describing some political idea and that's enough to be able to understand things. I also had a clip, but I'm not going to play it because it's just a little bit long, but I had a wonderful conversation with Ian Bruff, who's a colleague at Manchester University. And Ian is strongly interested in black metal and had a wonderful story to tell about Bursum, the black metal band from Norway. And we were trying to think about how the music could kind of create other ways of being global. But really what he was interested in when we talked about this was that these guys were really drawing on the way that the black metal music connects them to the overwhelming feelings, the sublime feeling of being, for example, in nature. But what's dangerous about that, right? The reason I think we need to think about it politically is because, as Ian pointed out, these guys are Nazis, right? And when they say nature, they're thinking blood and soil. So the other element to this then has to be, well, then how do we take that affect, that the ways that those sounds connect us, and make them into a kind of politics that we're less uncomfortable with, maybe happier to pursue than Nazism? So I think that well, Alice has given us a great place to start by thinking about it, about how our bodies are connected by music.
Matt, thank you. We got to Nazis within 12 minutes, so that's fantastic as a starting place. I just want to shift a little bit to Indra to see if you can, maybe from a lot of the experience that you've had, both combining that activism and also as a music maker yourself, can you just say a little bit to us about your own experiences about that connection between music and the political?
Okay, well, thank you. The connection between my activism during the Suharto time in the 1990s is quite interesting. And usually, when people talks about underground movement, mostly people thinking of progressive and leftist radicalism, yeah, which is like anarchism, socialist, and all that. But my activism in the 1990s, I was actually in the right-wing political stream. I was active in underground Islamic movements, but I found myself disillusioned by the movements, and which made me, find alternative political vehicle, which I found within underground music communities. And I didn't understand much about anarchism and socialism at the time, but um, I was so interested in underground music, particularly punk rock. And whilst I was active in the Islamic underground movement, and at that time we have, whether you're in the right or left political stream, we actually share the same common enemy, that is the new order authoritarian regime. So I didn't really care much about the ideological differences, but what I found from underground music cultural practices and ideologies of DIY, I felt like this is my place, and people don't care where you come from, and people can make friends despite class certifications and all that. And based on my experience, uh, music can move and mobilize people, and this has been proven in the Indonesian political history. Like in the midst of Cold War in the late 1960s, for instance, before there was punk rock and metal music, there was this rock and roll musicians called, his name was Roma Irama, and he used to play rock and roll, but then, um, because of the social and political situations at the time, he experimenting with his music where he fused Indonesian folk music with Arabic and Indian music, which produced a new genre called dangdut music. And apart from using this music as a way for him to become more popular, of course, he also used dangdut music to mobilize people against the ruling political party that sustains the authoritarian regime at the time. That happened in 1970s. And then one of the songs that Roma Irama wrote at the time, and it was very popular because it was very oppositional against the authoritarian government. He wrote a song about hak, it's called Hak Azazi, which means the basic rights. The song reminds people about their basic rights to free speech and religious freedom, the rights that were taken by the authoritarian state at the time. So, and then secondly, in the 1980s, we have a folk singer called, his name's Iwan Fals. This is like Indonesian versions of Bob Dylan, that voiced millions of people that were structurally oppressed by the state through his folk music. Iwan calling them to change and challenge the system which sustains oppression, corruption, and social injustices. This was exemplified by two of his famous songs that contain criticism toward the government, such as Bongkar, which means demolished, and Bento it's a nickname for officials who love to do corruptions and manipulating the people. And of course, like Kevin said, that again, underground music, especially punk music, since their arrival in the late 1980s and 1990s, have helped young people, particularly those who live in big cities, to deal with their socio-economic problems. This includes alienations, poverty, unemployment, and Western rock music, such as from Anthrax, The Clash, Crash, and Rage Against the Machine, actually help these young people to not only to articulate their anger toward the system, but also to channel their political aspirations against the corrupted system, and as well as to understand the social and political problems that they're facing at the time. And yeah, that's based on my experience. That's why I felt like, this is probably how I can involve myself in a different political activism at the time. So yeah, that's probably it,
Okay.
Debbie. Thanks.
Thanks, Indra. I think it's really interesting that you picked up on that real ambivalence that Matt brought up about when we talk about belonging or the feelings of belonging that music produces. It might not be our type of belonging. There's
Right.
Yeah.
there's some types of belonging that we might not want to belong to. So there's that
Yeah.
kind of ambivalence. I think that's really interesting, and we might want to think a little bit more about that. I want to turn to Marianne. Can you just share with us? You've had a long history thinking very carefully around the relationship between music and politics. Can you just give us your sense of how of some things that have come out of this conversation so far?
You're muted, Marianne.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I'm going to let the music do the talking, so to speak. So I hope that I can hit the synapses that my three colleagues have done. I just want to think, if we thought about politics, huge thing, music, huge. And we think of them like, they're interconnected in some way, but not completely and not tidally. And so it's the power of the conjunction. So there's politics of music, which is one particular thing to think about. There's politics in the music, for instance, what you're singing about. And there's politics through music. And I think we're talking about, particularly when it's different political movements, whether it be fascism or, the Nazis' use of music. So the of, the in, and the through are really, really important to me when I'm trying to think about this. And to me, it isn't just the words. So the words are where most of us try and get the immediate idea. There's also the ways you make music. So the Tusk Music Festival is about experimenting with ways of making music, the materials you make music with, but also these things about performance, how you perform something. And for me, everything's dependent on context. Context is everything. So the politics of a piece of music can change completely when the context changes. The politics in music can change again completely when the context changes. And the politics through the music can be a way of actually trying to steer a change in context or to create change through the context. So I'm going to use two extremes. I'm going to start with a lovely clip from Goldsmiths a couple of years ago. It's about sound systems culture, where these musicians are coming from dub and sound systems, Jamaican sound systems, where it's all about the politics of frequencies, deep bass, dub, bass. And we all know those frequencies, drum and bass. We all know them from reggae. And the idea is that bass frequencies travel a lot further. That's why our neighbors drive us bananas when their speakers are up too loud. It's not the treble we're hearing, it's the bass booming through our floor. And I'm going to show you a clip where Dub Morphology, which is a duo, and Aniruddha Das, who's from Asian Dub Foundation, are they're doing some stuff. It's experimental, it's using electronics, it's using sampling. And I'm just going to show you this, and you just have a listen, and then I'm going to show a completely different clip, if that's okay, Debbie, and then I'll just say one sentence after that. So bear with me, folks, because I'm not the best DJ. I'm never, so I now have to share my screen, right? Share screen. Yes. Okie doke. Here we go.
Yeah, it is most certainly political. These are political frequencies.
Okay, so can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, now those of you who are into visual cultures, there's several cues. Stuart Hall, sound system cultures, which are run by women who run their own sound systems, women who are their own selectors, And of course, these amazing guys who've been around for like as long as I can remember. And of course, as you all know, they're using samples, and this was just an example of how concentrating on the frequencies are really, really important in this particular understanding of politics, in the music of the politics of the music itself. And it's got nothing to do with what you're singing about. The only thing is Matt, I think we're all saying, is people need to understand the code to actually be able to identify with the bass frequencies. So that's the issue about different materials and understanding bass frequencies. It's a very political and cultural issue for Black and ethnic minority communities, particularly Black Britons, because these bass frequencies happen in public spaces, and they have to deal with the police, they have to deal with certain kinds of restrictions, and all the usual things about the structural racism in our society. So my second clip, Debbie, because I want to play this one, is that was very much experimental, as we understand it, electronic, using the latest technologies. But sometimes the politics of music, or a piece of music is political, can become this through context changes, and but also the way it's performed. And performance is very, very important as well. And I wasn't really thinking about that properly until I finished my latest book. Here comes the plug. My latest book, out with Oxford University Press, folks, in the new year. It's called Sampling Politics, Music and the Geocultural. And it forced me to really think really, really hard about what I'm trying to say when I say politics and in music. So now this is my second clip. I'm just going to play it because I think in a way it sort of sings for itself. Maybe not, but just bear with me. I have to share the screen first, don't I, right? And then I have to go here. And then, oh, this should work. Hang on.
You need to share your screen.
I need to share my screen, you're right.
There we go.
Okay, just let me get her back to the beginning.
And now the end is here, so I've got to face the final curtain. My friends, I'll make it clear, state my case, of which I'm certain. I've lived many lives that have been full. I've traveled each and every highway, but more, much more than this, I did it my way.
Okay, that's the first place. First of all, we all know this is Nina Simone at the height of her powers. This is My Way, the biggest piece of schmaltz we could ever possibly imagine. And here we're hearing it really politicized. She's got Afro-Caribbean percussion, and she's got this kind of jazzy little, sweet little lick on the piano. But if you look at the way she's singing it and hear what she does next.
Regrets, I've had a few, but then again, too few to mention. I did what I had to do, saw it through without exemption. I planned each charted course, each careful footstep along the byway. But more, much more than this, I did it my way. Oh, there were times, I'm sure you knew, when I bit off much more than I could chew. But through it all, when there was dark, I ate it up. Then I spat it out. Until my way. I loved to laugh.
Sorry, hang on, I have to stop it. Just,
I got chills.
I'd love to play the whole thing, folks, but I've only got so much time. So I get out of the full screen and stop sharing. Can you see me now?
Yep.
Good. Yeah, I mean, there's so much I can say about that clip. You'll never hear My Way ever again the same way once you've seen this. Her body, the way she's moving it, but she ate it up and she spat it out. 1971. 1971. So think about your world history, think about your political history in the US. I ate it up and I spat it out. And just the whole arrangement, the whole way she's singing it, the whole way she just completely transformed this schmaltzy song that even Frank Sinatra hated, and is actually a love song in its original version. So here what I'm trying to say is that music doesn't have to be in itself, when it was written, intentionally political, but it can become politicized, of course, in many, many ways. So that's the main issue. And the last point is my way, of course, for some of us who know our European history a little bit, Nina Hagen, the German punk diva of all German punk divas, took my way and used it at the, as a kind of symbolic Germanic English version at the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. Musically, far less interesting what she does. Politically, really important. So that's the tension. Sometimes the music isn't so good, but the politics are great. And sometimes the music's great and the politics have to be found or looked for. Lots more to say, Debbie. I think that's enough. Thank you very much.
Okay, Marianne, thank you so much. I think immediately the minute that we have a free, 10 minutes, all of us will be on YouTube to watch that entire clip many, many, many times. So Marianne, thank you so much for introducing that to those of us who hadn't seen that before. I think that's given us a really good and broad landscape to start to think about not just the outline of that, as Marianne talked about, that Venn diagram between music and politics, the of, the in, and the through. But also, I think what we want to push on to think a little bit more about is a particular kind of landscape for that tension, and that is the global. So what I think we want to move on to talk about specifically is how music helps us think about the global. And partly this is about because the crises, the multiple crises that we're currently facing are all global in character. So can we kind of maybe pick up from some of what has come out of this early discussion and think a little bit more about broadening that horizon? And Indra, is it okay? Can I start with you to maybe pick up on some of what has come up in that first conversation, but also in your own very localized experience, and then your own understanding of that global horizon?
Well, even though I have some local experiences regarding to this question, actually, some of my answer would probably quite similar to Matt and Kevin in this sense. And actually, Matt and Kevin's works actually really influenced my thesis a few years ago. And when I read their articles, it's like, this is it. This is exactly what I'm actually been thinking about. That especially me as an IR academic, it is important for me to channel myself with the world I am studying. Music helps me not only to think about the current state of our politics, but also to engage deeper emotionally with the politics and the people that were affected by the politics. It actually opens up the space to understand the issues of global politics better beyond what has been offered by conventional IR texts in classrooms. And this was felt strongly when I was doing my PhD fieldwork in several big cities in Indonesia, where I researched the transformations of underground music scene in the midst of the rise of Islamic conservatism. The rumors I heard before I come to the cities is that many of those who used to be progressive and leftist politically have shifted ideologically to conservative right-wing Islamism. So I was trying to find out what's wrong, what happened, what political conditions that actually, make them shifting. And my connection with underground music since the 1990s has helped me to get most access to my scene participants, the people that were often left out by established scholars of political science and IR. And through this connection, I can understand the problems that the young people were facing and why conservative Islamism happened to be their alternative. I was actually disagreed with them with their ideological position, although I was like them like many years ago, but I have changed. And but I just respected and understand very well the socio-economic problems that made them shifting ideologically. So in this case is that music, especially underground music, has helped me to channel my position as an academic with the people that I met during my fieldwork. It actually helps a lot in my PhD study, and after studying their cases, actually they were facing lots of socio-economic problems. Some of them like were indebted to bank for like almost 1 billion rupiah. Some of them were actually kicked out from their jobs, and many of them actually working in precarious working environments, which explains that actually the roots of these ideological transformations actually comes from the contradictions of capitalism, which also reflecting what's really happening in the world, where people also have become shifting to pretty much supporting or become part of right-wing populism. So I don't know if that answers your question, but hopefully, yeah.
No, that's fantastic. I think that also brings in a lot of the both on the ground, right, on the ground experiences, but also, yeah, the big elephant in all the rooms, which is the capitalism stuff.
Yeah.
Which is also, I mean, because what we haven't brought up is, of course, the music industry is both heavily, obviously a part of that music industry, which reproduces it, but also a lot of what's being talked about here are those careful ways in which that's being resisted or pushed against or troubled or fractured even. Can I turn to Marianne and just see if you can, we're just going to go backwards this time and see, I mean, your early work and I mean, this work sounds much more localized in terms of what you're doing within London, but I know you've had a long background of thinking the global through music. So can you maybe speak a little bit, because Indra talked about obviously the limits of academic imaginaries, and I think we've all experienced that. They're incredibly limited. So can you speak a little bit of how you've pushed against that to try to think about the global?
Well, I mean, I think first, just to pick up your point, Debbie, about capitalism, of course, by definition, everything we do musically and in terms of arts and culture is global because we use this technology, which is planetary. It has huge differences in terms of access and bandwidth. So that global in itself is partial, but it is in principle planetary. And certainly since the music downloading of the 90s, which took DIY to the web, and reinvented the web. But of course, the music majors and the big entertainment companies have been trying to push back. So we now call music sharing piracy. And now we've got Spotify, and the artists still don't earn no money. The royalties still go to the big companies. It doesn't matter whether it's Spotify. We've got other kind of platforms like Bandcamp and SoundCloud. So there's always this kind of push and pull in terms of that kind of transmission and the consumption. And also now in a time of Corona, music's being produced and consumed purely through these video conferencing apps. So whilst big companies like Zoom, Microsoft, Google, you name it, these are not plugs, by the way, get to harvest our data footprint, nonetheless, people are managing to make music and poetry, the arts, theatre. It's extraordinary the kind of artistic creative potential that's going on there. So music's always been, quote unquote, mobile, always very mobile. And troubadours, from the world over, from every culture, music's always traveled, no matter what form of music it is, from church music back to Gregorian chants, which are linked to ancient Arabic music, which are linked to Eastern Europe. Always traveled. So the global in itself is a highly relative term, but it's not a new term to the topic at all. So on that, my new book is actually looking at how I didn't realize how much traveling was going on until I had to get really deep into these analyses. And I traveled with the analysis. I've come a long, long way. I was shocked at how ignorant I was when I started the book. I hope I don't show that ignorance by the end of the book. But within a piece of music, just particularly by using a sample from another culture, which has its own issues as well about ethics and cultural appropriation. Nonetheless, it can be done in such a way that we travel with and alongside, as opposed to instead of. But the big companies have always got a part to play in this at the end of the day, one way or the other. Maybe we'll come back to that, but that's enough for now.
Yeah, we might come back to that, I would say. Kevin, can I turn to you and see
Sure.
your reflections?
Yeah, I think I'm going to echo a little bit of what Marianne said, right? But I think what's important is recognizing how music helps us kind of reconceive what is global, in part by reimagining the ways difference and distance are navigated. And we're seeing that right now here in the virtual Tusk 2020, how we're finding new ways to navigate distance and difference. And I think Marianne's point and your point earlier, Debbie, in terms of we are within the global capitalist system, right? There's no outside. But the way that music can function within that system and also against that system. Again, I look at DIY punk and look at the way like the local scenes are networked together through kind of informal, independent, and decentralized flows that work within, but also against capitalism. And that's not just exclusive to punk. But it draws attention to, if we're thinking about, as Marianne was talking about, like how musical forms and musical practices can go global very quickly, right? And think about musical products as well. And musicians are all traversing global geographic space, but they're not doing so equally. I can think about the ways in which musicians are flowing in a much more obstructed way, especially in 2020. I'm interested, especially looking at like bands on tour. So I have a clip here because there's a really interesting punk band called the Dumpies who exist almost entirely in order to travel the world to marginalized, that is off the beaten track local punk scenes, where they go and they want to make sure they can make connections with people in Brazil and Argentina, South Africa, where have you, to make those connections. And what I was doing was I was having a conversation when they were talking about their next tour, and they're organizing their next tour to Indonesia, and they're bringing along a South African band that they had made contacts with when they were in South Africa. And so this is, you'll have to excuse me because I'm in this as well. There's 3 screens here, but at the bottom is the lead singer of the Dumpies, Joel, talking. He's a little hungover, so he's working through some stuff, but you can feel his energy and excitement where he's going to be making some connections here, which I think are really important. And we're thinking about the global. So let me share this real quick.
This particular tour feels like a bigger, or like a game-changing thing for us in regards to like the community building aspects of like doing these tours or whatever, because we're bringing folks along with us from South Africa to Indonesia that have never been on an international tour before, and so there's like a 3-way sort of like cross-cultural kind of like bridge building kind of aspect or whatever that like hasn't been the case before when we've just been like going by on our own or whatever, and that feels really exciting. And like just like going on our own has like felt like so powerful and it's in the means of like us like witnessing and kind of building these connections and realizing and like just kind of witnessing like the like interconnected sort of like ness of all of like these different scenes all over the world or whatever. But now it's like, but the opportunity to like be like, bringing like, or like seeing folks connecting, like different communities connecting outside of like our direct path or whatever in it is like also like really an exciting opportunity and kind of like, gets my brain shooting off in a bunch of different directions in terms of like how that could be even like expounded on, you know, and which like, you know, because like whenever we go on these tours, I feel like we make so many like friends for life kind of, and there's like these like really, it's just this really potent kind of like bonding sort of moment, whatever, you know, like in that area. It's like what I was talking about with like every time I start booking a tour or whatever, I like one of the first conversations I have with the people, with the context that I get, whatever, is like what bands we're into at any given time, moment or whatever, you know, and it's like not in this way where it's like this sort of like clicky, like sceney, judgy kind of way. It's more just kind of like being able to like give some sort of contextual framework for like, oh, I know you're into this band. I know this band's whole history and like what they're like, you cultural context is, whatever. And so I can put you within that contextual framework and position you there and figure out who you are. Kind of, it gives you some place to start from, and then like that is like so like it's just really effective, and so when to like get to know, like an effective way to get to know somebody, and would get around these like weird cultural boundaries that exist really quickly, and so I think that maybe like that is related to like how it is when you're on tour, or why we're able to like make such like fast friends, on tour, and the idea of being able to like rope other folks into that or whatever, and like the more people you get bringing into that, whatever, like the strong, like then you're like it's like the most effective like community building kind of thing, like tool I can think of in a way, it's like how could we like employ that, like the sort of like bonds that we're making on these tours or whatever in like and like a strategical kind of like community organizing way, if that makes sense, like.
Yeah, so there's a lot of things that Joel's kind of putting out there, right, in terms of the way that music functions as kind of a global lexicon in terms of being able to circumvent cultural differences, and establishes these kind of intimate forms of cultural exchange that are kind of helping us redefine to navigate difference and distance in interesting ways. What was interesting in the conversation, which I encounter a lot, especially was very clear in the Dumpies conversation, is the way in which they become really aware of their own privilege. As they're moving across the global space, they become aware of global inequities and also the inequities of flows that they're able to go to South Africa. And because of their position of privilege, they're taking this South African band now, and they're able to go on this tour in Indonesia. Musical products and flows flow in different ways. The ways in which we think about the core and periphery is still going to matter, especially with musicians. And I think music helps us think about the intricacies and contradictions of capitalism, but also in terms of thinking about that core periphery relationship within the global, and coming up with opportunities to challenge that. I think, which again, virtual Tusk 2020 is an interesting kind of intervention of reimagining difference and distance in this moment. So,
Kevin, thanks. That's great. That was really helpful to kind of hear that energy as well, about how also the exciting, like how excited he was to do that, which goes back to what we were talking about, that sort of nonverbal aspect. Matt, can you work your magic and speak to how I know you've thought about this in wider questions of popular culture, but can you talk a little bit about that music and kind of specifically the global?
Yeah, actually, yes. And I'm afraid I'm going to be going to sort of more dark magic. Let me just check you can hear me, because I had a little problem with the mic before. Okay. Yeah, in preparing for this, I spoke with a friend and acquaintance, a really great guy that I know in Rio de Janeiro, called Pedro Azevedo. And Pedro has a venue called Audio Rebel. It's a small venue, recording studio. You can get about 50 people in there. It's an incredible center for experimental electronic punk. There's a huge range of stuff that he does there in Rio. And of course, with the crisis right now, it's closed, right? He's not able to keep the business going. Could talk more about that, but one of the responses they had, and I'm going to hopefully play a little clip for you where he explains what's happening, is that with the support of a grant that was offered from the Swiss government to an organization called Incidencias Sonoras, they had a festival, an online festival called In Out. So something kind of parallel to what we've been doing in Tusk. Let me just see, oops. Let me just see if I can share my screen. Sorry, bear with us. Here's Pedro. Tell me if somebody wave at me if you can't hear, okay?
That we did a project on Zoom. We did a program with 3 musicians from 3 different cities, curated by 3 venues. One venue, it's my venue here in Rio de Janeiro, Audio Rebel. One is in Buenos Aires, Rosette, and one is in Bogota. Mm-hmm. It's 3 scenes, musical scenes that we see a lot. We have much in common. And by the quarantine, we could communicate more and we start to do this. So we did some research on technology, and it was really quite, you can check out on the site Coincidências project on Provelcha.
Coincidências.
Yeah, in Out Festival. It's all recorded on Zoom. Each musician in their house using their gear, doing a set of improvising. For the first time, they met themselves. It was really an amazing project.
So for him, and for the musicians in particular, this is a really positive experience, right? Everybody really enjoyed the time. You can go and check this out in the In-Out Festival. Just Google it, right? So if you want, I can dig up the address, but it's on YouTube, right? And there were 3 different performances. Each musician, one in Buenos Aires, one in Rio de Janeiro, and one in Bogota, performing live on Zoom without having met each other before. It was an extremely interesting experiment. And again, very, very positive to be able to discover something that looks like a transnational space for musical creation. So that's the upside. That's the positive spin I want to give. The worry I have is, and this is a problem with the larger culture as well, is that, and this is where capitalism comes in. When the crisis hits and all these cultural venues are starting to suffer, and a lot of them are going to go broke, a lot of them are going to disappear. So what happens to the venues, right? What happens to the property? It's all going to get bought up, right? I mean, so here in England, we could say, your local's going to close, but the Wetherspoons is going to be fine, right? And if effectively, then we are seeing a concentration of property in the hands of fewer and fewer investors, for whom the value of the property isn't necessarily depending on people paying rent, but on the value that the property might have for exchanges in international property markets. So the physical space where people can actually do what we talked about at the beginning, where we physically come together and have that shared experience where our bodies are moving together with the music. That space looks to me like it might be shutting down a bit. The risk of the COVID crisis is that the space we have for doing that will actually get a lot more restrained and a lot more constricted. And so while I'm glad for the opportunities to see us beginning to push ourselves to go online, to have international and transnational collaborations, the risk I think we're facing right now, the political risk we're facing right now is that we find ourselves quite isolated while we're doing it.
Yeah, that was dark, Matt, but I think importantly dark. Like, I think that's one of the, yeah, we have to engage with that. And that brings us to, I guess, our third and sort of summing up kind of question, really, which is about the multiple crises we're facing at the moment. We know this story. We know that when crises happen, the arts are the first thing to get kicked in the balls, right? We know that that's what happens. But can we maybe speak a little bit about how the intersecting crises? So it isn't just COVID-19, it's austerity, it's the climate crisis, it's all kinds of protest politics in and around structures of power. But how what is this provoking in music? Like what is music responding to? And I'll get you, Kevin. I know you're super excited with that one. So how is music being provoked and what's it producing in response? But also I think what Matt's example there gives us is actually how music itself is being affected in frightening ways that we don't know what that's going to look like, and also the short and long-term versions of that. So Kevin is like bursting. So I'm going to start with Kevin. Okay. And then we'll move on. So Kevin.
Sure. Sorry, I didn't mean to grab the microphone, but I'm going to grab the microphone, right?
Do it.
One thing to start out is just to recognize that musicians, lots of musical genres have been thinking about and talking about and responding to these crises for a long time. Whether it's hip hop, DIY punk, lots of musicians have been thinking about the collapse of capitalism, about the rise of authoritarianism, about racism, about sexism, right? The climate change, the kind of crises that you mentioned. A lot of musicians have been spending a lot of time, musicians and also the communities around them, articulating a critique, but also articulating possible responses to them. So I don't want to just wallow in the kind of the hopelessness. I think a lot of, especially underground alternative musical genres, have been constructing alternative ways of being and interacting that provide us with tools for dealing with crises. And so just going back to Matt's point, right, absolutely some of the established infrastructure that is in place, especially within the industry, the music industry, that is so tightly tied to global capitalism, has been incapacitated by COVID-19. But a lot of underground musicians and musical activists, right, see this as opportunities, right? So venues are closing, but if your musical form isn't based on the geographical infrastructure, if you're doing house parties, if you're doing pop-up venues, if you're doing temporary autonomous zones, right, you've got the tools to respond. And I think we are in a crisis. What it's going to look like in 5 years, that landscape is going to definitely change. But I think we should recognize that there's spaces for opportunity that musicians and musical communities have been planning for and acting on. One of the things, just my final point here, is a lot of the, with the COVID-19 crisis, and then in this country, the Black Lives Matter crises, it was really interesting to see how a lot of the DIY punk communities were like, we're ready for this. We can do this. Oh, we can set up free food distribution, right? Whether in the United States or to my brothers in Rebel Riot in Myanmar, right? They're doing the work because this is what the structures they already have in place. Alternative ways of caring and community building that I think we need to recognize that are functioning alternatively or in contradiction to global capitalism, are finding spaces that are open here. I don't want to be Pollyannish and think this is great, but I do want to recognize that work that's being done there.
Absolutely. I'm going to turn to Marianne because I know you have some things you wanted to respond to here.
I wanted to play something, if I may. It's this is one where you have to close your eyes and listen really hard. To take Kevin's point about the long historical tale, I'm going to play you something from the granddaddy of experimental electronic music. That's Karlheinz Stockhausen, straight out of the avant-garde 1960s, a piece called Hymnen, which is called National Anthems. And as we are speaking of the day of German unity, 3rd of October, and I mentioned Nina Hagen, I'm going to go way back. Now, problematic in all sorts of ways, but also I think you can see how musicians might actually want to take the materials that sound so familiar and flip them on their heads and get us to think a little bit about the attachments and the cognition process. So I'm not going to say anything. Debbie, if you let me play it, that's okay. Maybe make a couple of points.
Yeah.
But I think I have to share my screen so you can hear it.
Yeah.
Just 3 things. It's a very famous melody. It was written by an old guy called Joseph Haydn. It used to be an imperial anthem. Then it was an anthem that got attached to Nazism. Then it got detached from Nazism. Now it's part of another anthem. It's a great melody, back to where I started. And now listen to what Stockhausen does to it in the 1960s at the height of the space race, the height of the Cold War, at the height of, what's the other thing that's going on? The nuclear armament and people landing on the moon. And around the time this thing was released, eventually we've had several political assassinations, including Martin Luther King. So this is where music, which is embodied, is supposed to be politically purposed, is being repurposed. That's enough. I'm going to play it. So let me just do the screen share. Bear with me. And here we go. Share. Play. okay, most of us don't know, but that last little sample is actually the fascist marching song that got attached to the German national anthem, which got Stockhausen into all sorts of trouble with the radio, public radio. So that's just an example of how music itself can be problematized in really important ways. And I think that's what musicians are doing all the time, particularly if they're aware of the politics of the music they're making and the political context in which they're making it. And this goes back to the 60s, and that goes back, of course, for Stockhausen to the 40s, which goes back and goes back and goes back. And that circularity is not a form of anti-modernism. It's not a form of anti-progressivism. It's actually an understanding that even if we come round in the circle, we're somewhere different than where we were before. So that's kind of, for me, the global is, for me, simply something that's more than me and something that's more than us. So when the me and the us become attached to other me's and us's, and as Matt points out, that isn't always the us, or you, Debbie, was saying that we want to be part of. But nonetheless, it can be repurposed and troubled. So I think Stockhausen himself understood that more than anybody else when he put that little excerpt of 2.5 minutes together in the middle of a 2.5-hour piece of experimental electronic music that still sets the bar today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Marianne. Indra, can you come in and speak a little bit about the kind of this notion about the intersecting crises that we're facing from your perspective?
Actually, most of my answers are already shared by Kevin and Matt, but I agree completely. Actually, what Kevin said, what I was going to say before that, you know, this global pandemic of COVID-19 has affected the global economy, and including Indonesia, and it has actually increased the rate of unemployment and poverty in Indonesia. And Semeru Institute, one of the think tanks in Indonesia, actually have made a study that they have predicted that by the end of 2020, the rate of poverty in Indonesia will be increased to 12.4%, which is like, there will be like extra in total there will be like 8.5 million people have fallen into poverty. And this is including the people who work in the music industry. And I've been witnessing what's been happening in my local underground music scene, that many of my friends who work in they have jobs, but it just the place, the environment they work, just really precarious. So they don't have any insecurity of their income, and to feel secure, they're really relying on participating in or working or helping out with bands and musicians to become technicians. And every time there's music events, shows, concerts, and tours, you know, this has actually helped them a lot economically. But since the pandemic has made Indonesian government to restrict the social and cultural gatherings, so we don't have any more concerts allowed, and that actually have created suffering amongst many of us, especially those who don't have any other jobs. And like Kevin said, actually, this is actually not the end. And although the feeling of solidarity within amongst underground youth once experienced like a decline, like people didn't really have a strong sense of solidarity since the commercializations of underground music in mid 2000s. Yeah, but apparently since this crisis, this COVID pandemic happened, actually the solidarity comes up again. And I've been witnessing that DIY Indonesian DIY communities, particularly in Bandung, where I come from, they have started to setting up like solidarity movements, like providing free foods, opening public kitchens, which now actually there are about 20 public kitchens across Bandung city. And this consists of not only chefs, but social activists and musical activists and underground musicians who, you know, don't have anything else to do and they just want to help people around them, which is a good thing. So it helps a lot of people who are actually in needs and those who live in the streets. And then the second thing is that the music itself has become more digitalized and become more virtual. And thanks to the internet, with the technology of live streaming, now we have come to an idea to perform our music through live streaming. And in order to help the band technicians or crews, we actually open donations from the audiences, hundreds of audiences watching this show. For example, there's this an independent live streaming show. It's called Ripple the Show, a tribute to the crews. And I will show you the video, an example of the video of a Bandung-based punk rock band that actually amongst the earliest punk rock bands that doing this live streaming performance. And actually, it's a very brilliant idea to help underground musicians and technicians to survive economically. So bear with me. I think Kevin knows this band, Turtle Junior. Right.
You turned me on to him.
Here you go.
Tanah yang anjing edan. Oke, lagu selanjutnya Merdeka Tapi Mati. Sombong bangun negeri kami, kaya raya bumi pertiwi. Yang dikini tiada lagi, tawahan reformasi. Merdeka tapi mati. Tangisan anak negeri. Merdeka tapi mati. Dijajah masa sendiri. Mengambil semuanya, merampas segalanya. Takut bangun muda, alamku hancur dan murka. Merdeka.
All right, that's just an example. And I think that was the live performance from like 4 weeks ago. So now there have been more bands doing the live streaming. This is a really good idea to help the musicians and their technicians. And there's also what do you call it? There's also a movement where underground youth, since they don't have any place to hang out together anymore, and it's not allowed, and to overcome their fear of getting infected, get sick because of the virus. Now, underground youth that used to hate doing exercises now become more active outdoor, and they do roller skating. They learn how to do skateboarding. They also buy bicycles and start bicycling around the city. And one of the movement that this underground youth made was actually called hardcore punk bike or something. So they always like bicycling all together, like dozens of them, going around the city, and pretty much just just to become healthy and become more stronger, as they don't face the crisis by themselves. They have friends to be with them. I'm just gonna show you a little bit of that really shortly, probably only 1 minute.
So
Okay.
we're almost out of time.
We're almost out of time, so 1 minute, and then I'll go to Matt.
Okay. Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Probably just never mind about it.
Okay.
There's a technical problem at the moment, but yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. In our minds, we can imagine the roller skaters.
Yeah.
Matt, I just want to come to you for just a response to a question that came up in the chat, really, which was about the difference between sort of the virtual efforts we're trying to make to have that connection and that sense of belonging. And I think that the statement was, at some point, physical gigs are necessary with the sweat and the stink. So can you just say, just to close us off here, that notion between the virtual and the actual?
So, it was interesting. The question popped up at me as well. And we've kind of got another one about sort of thinking, well, what are the solutions for how we might go about supporting the DIY communities and whatnot? And I want to give a few minutes also to Kevin, and maybe also to Indra, because I know these guys know a little bit more about it than I do. I'm going to be very quick because we've only got about 5 more minutes before we got to get off. But I just want to sort of say that from my view, what I've been struggling with here has to do with the way that these kind of multiple crises we've been talking about, the political, the environmental, the economic crises, right? The way these things have, the way that they have all sort of come together. I have a question in my head as to whether they are bringing about, or whether they're based on, or whether they have consequences for something like we might describe as a kind of cultural crisis. And when I say that, I don't mean that the culture is falling apart, right? And so I want to really endorse what I think that Kevin's rejoinder to me when I said that we're losing our space. The question came up about, well, what happens to gigging with COVID, right? As Davey said, it's very hard to put 50 people safely together in a small room right now, right? And yet, the terrain is shifting all the time. And I think what Kevin and what Indra tried to point out about the way that musicians in particular communities, and particularly certain punk and other kinds of other forms of self-reliant, capable forms of music, are putting their own communities forward and working to promote their own capacities. These are, yeah, that's really true. I just think we have to see it as a conflict, as a struggle, right? There will be, there's a clear effort to try and close down cultural spaces. We can see it very, Poland and Hungary and in Russia now, even here in a lot of ways, the attacks on the BBC. So cultural spaces are being closed down all the time. And we may try to continue finding other kinds of spaces. Mushrooms are sprouting elsewhere, but they have to be aware of the fact that we do these and we pursue these goals in the face of opposition. Yeah, sorry, too much.
That's okay. Listen, I'm aware that we're basically out of time. And I know, Matt, you want to play us out with some closing credits. What I'm going to suggest, I know, because predictably in these things, some really interesting questions have come up in the chat. So I'm going to suggest to the panelists that you guys go on to the chat and hopefully continue some of those conversations, because it's around this particular tension around the closing, the results of oppression that are coming through these crises, and how the crises are being used as excuses to make these closures. And also Kevin's, I always appreciate Kevin's sort of resurgent notion that there's always these spaces that we're using to push back against those closures. So I think that tension is at the heart of what we've all been talking about. But I think, so if I can encourage all the panelists to go onto the chat to respond to those, I think that would be great. I want to thank everybody for engaging with the questions and with each other and with these. I mean, these questions are not going to leave us. So I've been really pleased and happy to be able to be a small part of this. So thank you to everybody. Thank you to everybody on the chat. Stay safe. And hopefully we can pick up on these questions and these issues at another virtual or hopefully actual meet space.
Thank you, Debbie.
Thank you, Debbie.
Thanks, everybody. Matt.
Thank you, guys, everyone. Thank you for coming, joining us.
Until they take it back.
Thank you, Tusk Festival. Have a good one.
Thank you, Tusk.
Have a good one.
Thank you.
Stay strong.
Treason! 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 Shot so loud, God cannot hear. Your thoughts and prayers are on deaf ears. Shot so loud, God cannot hear. Your thoughts and prayers are on deaf ears. And I don't need their thoughts and prayers. They're hollow eyes, they're vacant stares. And everyone knows that we're broken. Can't you see the cracks are showing? We don't need their sympathy for all the shit they've done to me. Tearing us all apart. They got no soul, they got no heart. And it's treason! 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 This is how it's gonna end. Treason! 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 This is how it's gonna end. God, I don't give a damn about your thoughts and prayers. God, I don't give a damn about your thoughts and prayers. Treason! 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 This is how it's gonna end. Treason! Treason!